The power and the beauty of the ocean has always intrigued me. And in this lesson, we're going to try to capture that power and beauty in a pastel drawing. Hello there everyone, Matt here with thevirtualinstructor.com, and in this lesson we're going to use pastels to try to capture the power and the beauty of the ocean in this wonderful wave. Now we're going to talk about composition, and we're also going to try to capture that beauty and power through our mark making. If you're new to the channel or if you haven't done so yet, I suggest that you subscribe. We cover a broad variety of drawing and painting media and subject matter here. And if you want to go a little bit deeper with your drawing and painting, I suggest you check out our membership program. Our membership program includes a variety of drawing and painting courses on a variety of subject matter and media, weekly live lessons, which are broadcast live for members and also recorded, so they're stored in our vault, weekly critiques as part of the Members Minute, and a year-long curriculum for visual arts teachers. If you want to check out our membership program, I'll leave a link in the description below. But if you want to just dabble a little bit and check out 3 of our course videos and ebooks for free, I'll leave a link in the description below for that as well. We're going to be using Rembrandt pastels for this. I'm also going to be using a couple of pastel pencils here. And we're also going to be working on Canson Mi-Teintes pastel paper. Now, we're going to be working on the heavily textured side of this paper. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the process and create this wonderful drawing. Obviously, the photo reference already has a strong composition, but there's a reason why this composition is strong. We'll notice here that there is a strong line that happens here that divides basically the cooler side of the wave from the warmer side of the wave. This line, this little edge that happens right along the ridge of the wave, is incredibly important in the success of this composition. This edge basically forces the viewer's eye to move right along it. And we want to make sure that this is not lost in the final image. We want to accentuate it so that our composition is as dynamic as it possibly can be. We'll get started here on the Canson Mi-Teintes pastel paper with a pastel pencil. Now I'm working on the heavily textured side of the paper. There are 2 sides to this paper, and both sides are suitable for pastel applications. One side of the paper has an extremely heavy tooth, and this is the side that I'm working on. The other side of the paper still has a textured surface and is still suitable for pastel applications, as I mentioned, but since we're going to be applying lots of layers of pastels, I chose to work on the heavily textured side of the paper. You can see I'm using a reddish brown pencil, and I'm holding the pencil fairly low on the shaft and using it almost more like a paintbrush rather than a pencil. I'm making loose, sketchy marks here, just trying to find the composition. So I'm trying to find the flow of the wave and, of course, the distant hillside as well. With the basic sketch in place, I'm going to begin work in the distant background. Throughout this process, I'll work mainly from the upper part of the picture plane down to the lower part of the picture plane. Essentially, I'm working my way from the areas that are further away from the viewer to the areas that are closer. As you can see here, I've started with a light blue, and now I'm applying a bit of gray and some other blues over the top. I want to create a gradation here from a darker blue on the left side over to a lighter, almost red-purple on the right side of the sky, just adding a little bit more interest than what we see in the reference. I'm also trying to keep the strokes that I'm making here fairly consistent. As you can see, most of them are going at a diagonal. Since pastels can have an opaque quality about them, this allows us to work from the background to the foreground, just like if we were working with an opaque painting medium like acrylics or oils. So you can see I've overlapped the horizon line with additional pastel applications, and that will make the connection between the horizon line and the background sky a little bit more seamless, instead of working on the foreground or the middle ground first and then trying to fill in the sky later in the process. This is why, of course, again, that we're working from the background to the foreground. And as you can see, I'm layering lots of different colors here as I'm working in the background. There's some reds, some red purples, some orangey browns. There's also some yellow greens, some blue greens. There's some blues underneath and some blacks. So essentially, when you're working with a medium like pastels that require the material to be layered, you just need to be patient and apply colors and allow those colors to be layered and gradually build up on the surface. This is especially true when you're working with a heavily textured surface like we are here. You can see in the early stages when I move on to a new section, the material is fairly sparse. It's not reading very well, but as I continue to add more layers and build up depth in that color, the colors start to make a little bit more sense, and the values do as well. Now, a lot of these distant hills that we see in this particular image are a little bit faded. The colors are muted. The colors aren't quite as intense. So I'm using lots of grays and some neutral colors here as well. There are some applications of black as well, but as you can see, or as you'll see, I'll start to mute these blacks as I add additional colors over the top. Areas that are further away from the viewer are typically less intense in contrast, so that means our darks are not going to be quite as dark as they are in the foreground, and I need to keep this in mind as I continue to work my way from the background to the foreground. I'm also trying to punch up some colors here and there, so I'm trying to make the oranges a little bit stronger and the greens a little bit stronger as well. It might not be completely obvious here, but we do have a color relationship happening here between some of the purples, the greens, and the oranges. These colors are secondary colors, and they are equidistant from each other on the color wheel, so they provide some pop and contrast, and I'm going to try to pull out some of these color relationships here and there. There's obviously some blues that are pretty dominant in this scene, but we can clearly see the greens. There are some purples in some of the shadowed areas, and again, some of those oranges in the distant hills. Now, of course, it's important to ensure harmony and unity in any piece that you create, and when we're working with a color image like we are here, one of the ways that we can create color harmony or harmony and unity in the piece is by making sure that we use consistent colors throughout the process. So what I'm doing here is whenever I pull out a pastel color, a new color, I put it in this little area next to the artwork. You can see it in the bottom left-hand corner. And throughout the process, you'll see these pastels continually grow as I add new colors to the piece. This will ensure that I'm using consistent colors and making sure that the piece is harmonious in the colors that I use. And I'm making sure that I'm not using just one color in one area either. So if I use a color in one area, I make sure that I use it in another area as well, again, to ensure that harmony and unity. Now, color intensity is also important. You can see that I'm de-intensifying or muting some of the colors in the distance there with some grays. You can see how effective that is. So after I've put down some colors that seem pretty bold, a little bit of gray over the top mutes it down. It makes it look like it's further off in the distance. Now we're going to go ahead and address some of the main focus of this image, of course, the wave. You can see I've started with a lighter blue here on the shadowed side of the wave, and then right in the middle I've started to put a little bit of a warmer highlight there. That may look like it's white, but it's actually kind of a cream color. I'm going to gradually build up the shadow and the color contrast in this wave. So in the shadowed side we see a lot of cool colors, but on the highlighted side, on the right side of the wave, we see actually a lot of warm colors. The colors on the right side of the wave kind of lean a little bit more towards a yellow-green, and the colors on the shadowed side of the wave lean a little bit more to a blue or a blue-purple. So we're going to try to bring this out in our pastel image, of course. And in order to do this, of course, we're going to have to layer lots of different colors. So in this initial stage, I'm kind of experimenting a little bit with the colors that I add. So I'm grabbing colors, putting them into the piece, and seeing how they work with the other colors that I already have in place. And then gradually, you'll see I'm building up these applications. Again, I can't reiterate this enough, when you're working with a medium like pastels, or this is even true with colored pencils, you have to be patient and allow those colors to really layer up in order to get to a point where you're getting some realism or you're communicating the subject the way that you want to communicate the subject. Now, obviously in this piece, I'm also taking a little bit more of an impressionistic, more deliberate mark-making approach. So there is going to be some blending, and you can see I'm using some blending here with one of the soft tools that's typically used for pan pastels. But I'm also trying to focus on creating deliberate, strong marks with the pastels. And you'll see this most evident around the areas where we have some of that sea spray. So I'm going to try to get some energy in my mark making and try to communicate the power of this particular wave through the marks that I make. Now you can see I'm also using a bit of black here. I'm using it sparingly to make some of the values a little bit darker. So I'm not using black on its own, but I'm using black over the top of colors and then gently blending that in to create those darker grays. I think it's real easy for beginning artists to put down a few layers like we have here and get a little bit discouraged because the image isn't looking the way that you would expect it to look, even with a few layers. But again, I just want to, again, emphasize the point that if you continue with it and you continue working and continue pushing and pulling values and colors back and forth, you'll eventually get to a point where you're happy with your applications. But you just have to be patient and work through these initial stages and trust your instincts, trust the colors that you're choosing. And really, to be honest with you, the colors are not as relevant as you think they might be. Really, what's more important is the value, which is the darkness or lightness of the colors that you're applying. So as long as you get the values close to being accurate, you're going to be able to communicate your subject just fine. The colors are kind of a little bit of a bonus there. So just work patiently and trust yourself, trust your instincts, and work through these stages where things just feel like they might not be going the way that you expect them to go. You can see I'm bringing in some lighter yellow greens, some blue greens here and there as I continue to push that relationship between the darker side or the cooler side of the wave and the warmer side and the lighter side of the wave there, because this contrast is so incredibly important for capturing the light within the scene. Now, clearly, the direction of the stroke that you make is important, plays a role in communicating the subject. Right side of the wave, we can see those directional strokes are flowing in kind of a slightly curved direction, but on the lower part where we have the water, those directional strokes are flowing down the wave. Now, the opposite of this is happening on the other side of the wave. Again, the directional strokes are flowing down the face of the back side of the wave. Here's a little bit of a closer look at what we're seeing, and you can kind of see that these colors and values are just sitting right next to each other on the surface. That's what's giving it kind of that impressionistic feel, which is kind of what I'm after. I want this image to look fairly representational from a distance, but when you get up close, you really see those unique pastel marks. Of course, as we work down towards the foreground, we need to keep in mind that the cliffs continue. So I'll address these cliffs over here. You can see I've started with a bit of black, and then I'm adding some of those reddish browns, some of those oranges over the top, and eventually I'll go back over this section again with a gray to mute it. Now, of course, there are more blues and blue purples on the left side of the wave, left side of the picture plane, so I'm bringing in some of those as well. But where light is hitting, the light is a little bit warmer, so you can see I'm using a little bit of a light yellow-green there in the distance. Now, gray is such a powerful color when it comes to working with a colored medium like pastel and colored pencils, of course, because it changes the intensity of the color. And you can imagine if we had an image where all the colors were just applied without any alteration to the intensity, it would almost seem like the piece was screaming at you visually. So grays, of course, allow for some more dynamic colors because we can adjust the intensity of the color. And by having some areas where the color is less intense, of course, that allows us to have marks that are a little bit bolder in other areas and create that contrast in the color intensity. And a lot of the colors on the shadowed side of this wave are lessened in intensity, so a lot of grays are used here, of course. Now I've switched over to a pastel pencil, and this black pastel pencil is making dark marks, but the black is not quite as strong as the stick pastel that I've been using. But even still, I need to add a little bit of color to these dark areas, so a dark green is used here to do so. Now, pastels are clearly a drawing medium because the medium is applied dry, but the thought process is more closely related to painting. And in painting, especially with opaque painting mediums, we're considering the shapes of color and value that we're applying to the surface. If we get those shapes of color and value correct or close to being correct, then the illusion is created in the painting. And of course, this is the same process when we work with pastels. Of course, the result is a little bit more immediate because we can put the color down and immediately see the relationships instead of worrying about mixing colors. All of the mixing happens on the surface, but again, the thought process is still clearly the same. So I feel like when you're working with pastels, you probably need to stand back every once in a while and look at the relationships of the darks and the lights. Look at the relationships of the colors and see how they're reading, see how the illusion is created. You know, when we work with a graphite pencil or pen and ink, we can be really up close with the artwork, and we're actually drawing in the details as we develop the image. With pastels, it's a little bit different. We're making strokes with the pastel stick, but these strokes are a little bit more like paintbrush strokes. So we need to stand back every once in a while and look at the art and analyze how effective we are at creating these value and color relationships. So you can see I'm making some fine adjustments to some of the shadows here with that pastel pencil. Again, I like this pastel pencil because it's not quite as intense as making marks with a pastel stick. I'm using Rembrandt pastels. They're very strong, very pigment rich, but that pastel pencil is a little bit harder, so less of the material comes off on the surface and allows me to create some darker grays without committing to a black. Now you can see as I'm working here to the foreground, I'm starting to create that transition here from some of those greens and blues to some of those purples. And these purples, I really enjoyed the final look here. So I pushed the purples a little bit further than what I was observing in the reference. Again, this was one of those artistic decisions I made that deviate a little bit from the reference, but in my opinion, I feel like it improves the drawing or improved the final pastel painting. Now, this gray I'm adding here, it's definitely leaning a little bit towards purple, and I use this gray throughout this piece, as you may have noticed. It's a very dark gray, but it also has a little bit of a purple feel, which is perfect for this particular image. But here in the foreground, the extreme foreground, we've got lighter values and warmer colors. So you can see I've switched over to a lighter and warmer pastel. It may look white here, but this is actually a very light yellow ochre. Now, of course, some of the highlighted areas in this darker gray area that leans a little bit purple, I'm using purple for the highlighted areas so that that feels a little bit more natural, of course. And I'm using horizontal strokes here, again, simply because the water kind of dictates that you use horizontal strokes. And this is a good area to see those directional strokes that I was referring to earlier. Now, one thing that I think gets lost a lot of times when you're watching an instructional video like this is the amount of time that goes into creating a piece of art like this. And I think a lot of times it's real easy to underestimate the amount of time that goes into a piece of art. This particular piece took around 15 or 16 hours to complete from start to finish. Now, it's not a small drawing. I believe the size is 14 inches by 15 inches, perhaps, if I remember correctly, but it's not overly huge either. So it's larger than what I normally work with, but it's smaller than a lot of artists work with. But what's most important, of course, is the amount of time so that you understand how much time went into this drawing. A lot of artists who are brand new to art making, whether it be with pastels or any other medium, have the tendency to think that artworks are produced in a shorter period of time than they actually are. So if you're one of those folks, maybe next time you create a piece of artwork, maybe commit a little bit more time to it than you normally do. And if you feel like 15 hours or 16 hours seems a little bit overwhelming, just remember that you can take your artwork in pieces. I created this artwork over the course of several days. So I would work for about an hour or 2 hours, and then I would take a break and stop and maybe work for another hour or 2 hours on the same day. I think those breaks are really important. They allow your mind to refresh a little bit. And of course, your creativity is so important when you are making marks and when you are creating. And I feel like your creativity can kind of wane a little bit if you force yourself to work too much. So I think those breaks are incredibly important. So just be patient and allow yourself to have the time that you need to produce the results that you want to produce. Now you can see I'm adding some of these really strong highlights right along that crest, right along the edge of the wave, which is so incredibly important to our composition. You can see that I'm simplifying these a little bit and making them flow a little bit more in line with what I want compositionally in this particular piece, that flow that goes right along the spine or the edge of the wave, all the way up to the upper left-hand portion of the picture plane. Now, clearly there's more visual information there in the reference. We can clearly see this, especially in the lower right-hand portion of the picture plane. But by simplifying this particular area and adding less highlights, I'm actually putting more emphasis on that line that draws the viewer from the lower part of the picture plane all the way up through the middle of the picture plane and out to the upper left-hand portion of the picture plane. So we can make changes, obviously, to our photo reference, which we've discussed already. And as you can see in this drawing, that will enhance the composition and make the final image a little bit more interesting. Now, at this point, I'm just simply fine-tuning some of the things that I see in the background and the middle ground. As you work through a piece, obviously, you're going to see areas that you need to go back and make adjustments to, and you should always feel like you have permission to do that. So as you continue to work, in this particular case, to the foreground or the lower part of the picture plane, feel free to go back and make adjustments because the overall image, obviously, is most important. And you're going to notice value relationships and things a little bit more clearly as you get more material on the surface. So here in the foreground, a bit more purple is added. Again, we'll continue to add some of these darks here, now exclusively with the black pencil here, because I like, again, how much it's muted when we apply it to the surface. Now, as we work to the foreground, we're going to begin increasing the contrast here. If you'll remember, when we were talking about the distant hills, I was talking about using grays to mute the contrast. So there's less contrast typically in value for areas that are further away, but usually higher contrast in areas that are closer to the viewer. And we can clearly see this in the waves in the foreground where we have some really strong light. The shadows aren't quite as strong, but the contrast in this area is strong. So I'm going to allow my marks to be a little bit more deliberate here in the foreground with less blending and additional contrast. You'll see this gradually develop, especially in the lower right-hand portion of the picture plane. On the left side of the picture plane, however, we're going to still increase the contrast. You can see I'm adding a little bit of a lighter gray, but in this particular section, we have a little bit less definition because the sea spray is just making this section feel a little bit more blurry and less defined. But as we work to the right side of the picture plane, we'll allow those areas to be more defined and higher in contrast. In the foreground, we can really see that contrast between some of the warmer highlights and some of the cooler shadows. And for most of the cooler shadows, I'm using blues and obviously some purples. Purple, you got to keep in mind, is a transition color, so it can lean a little bit warmer, it can lean a little bit cooler, depending if it has more red or more blue in it. In this particular case, the purple is kind of feeling a little bit more cooler, especially nestled right next to some of these warmer creams and lighter yellow ochres that I'm adding here for some of the highlights on the waves. Again, this may look like I'm making white applications, but this is a very, very light yellow ochre. In fact, white is not used in this piece at all. I'm using the very light values of some colors that actually have a hue or a color associated with them. So white, like black, can kind of make things feel a little bit flat and unnatural. And in this particular case, this is obviously not something that we want to happen. So it's usually a better idea to use a lighter value of a color instead of using white to make the highlights. A few more indications of some of those distant waves, a little bit of sea spray there on the right side of the wave, and just a touch of a little bit of a cooler, more interesting blue here in the foreground. And then, of course, after these marks are made, our pastel image of this wave, this interesting wave, is now complete. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you were able to pick up a couple of things here and there. Remember, if you're new to the channel or if you haven't done so yet, make sure you click on that subscribe button and click on the notification bell so you're notified when we upload new videos as well. Thanks again for watching, and as always, I wish you all the very best in your artistic success.